It's a whole year since The Girl Who Died first aired. Watch on to find out why I don't really like it that much. Yeah, roll the titles. So, The Girl Who Died. Now, just before I begin, I want to just make it clear that while this series is called Defending Series 9, how can I put this? There are certain moments, certain elements of the series, one kind of episode, which is this one, because I don't actually mind Sleep No More or Hellbent or any of the other stories, I find them great. But The Girl Who Died, it's not a bad story, but it's just the weakest of the bunch. And it's in a slightly different league, it does slightly different things, and yeah, it's a different kind of tone to the rest of them, I think. It's a lot more light-hearted. It's a kind of more 11th Doctor story, really. You know, it doesn't really fit into Series 9, but the series couldn't do without it, in a way, because it does introduce Ashilda, and it does have the revelation about how the Doctor got his face, so I do appreciate the story, but as well as that, while I am going to try and defend The Girl Who Died, as I am doing for every single other episode of the series, this is not just going to be praising this story, because it's not flawless. It's going to be a critical analysis, picking out the best bits, but also saying, okay, this didn't work quite as well as other moments in the series and other stories in the series. So now that I've got that out of the way, we'll begin with a positive note. The pre-title sequence. I found it very imaginative and inventive, and while we have had lots of great pre-title sequences so far in the Capaldi era, and particularly in Series 9, such as the Breaking the Fourth Wall last week and Before the Flood, this is just as good, but it's a very different way of opening a story. I just found it a great way to open mid-adventure. I think first of all the choice to open mid-adventure is different to any other story of the series, and it kind of gives us a bit more of an insight into what the Doctor and Clara get up to off-screen, because they have all these other adventures as well. So I found that quite interesting. The whole thing about the thing in her suit and the Doctor teleporting her back to the TARDIS, it was played out really well, I think. On initial watch, I didn't actually notice the talk of tidal waves and rules early on. Well, I did notice that slightly annoying line from Clara about, "You never tell me the rules about time travel and things," but the Doctor, he goes on about ripples and tidal waves, and obviously that's linked to Ashilda later on in the story, but I didn't realise it was foreshadowed here as well, so that's a nice little thing that I picked up on this rewatch. I did think the destruction of the sonic sunglasses was hilarious, and I also love it how, although it was unintentional, it mocks fans that first said, "Oh, the sonic screwdriver is being overused," and then they brought in the sonic specs, and they said, "Oh, we don't like them either," and then finally those fans probably thought, "Oh, they've been destroyed, yay," but then they just come back in the next story. I bet that really miffed them off, and I shouldn't find that funny, but I do really. That's quite humorous. But anyway, the titles, I think they're in sync. I'm definitely getting better at spotting. They might have been slightly out, but I think for the most part they were in sync, so that is good. Now, the design of the Viking village, the whole aesthetic look of this story, the design of the sets and the costumes and the music as well, Murray Gold's score, it all comes together to make this really believable Viking setting. You might know that I've actually been to the Coniston medieval village where this was filmed in the summer when I went to Cardiff, and having seen that and how different it looks to the Viking village that we see in this story, because obviously they had to alter the roofs, alter the ends of the houses, alter the gardens and the plants and all sorts of stuff. They must have done absolutely loads to it because it looked completely different when I went in the summer. So I definitely appreciate the work that went into that more now. And the whole design of the Viking village was just superb. Really, really well done. I also really like the colour grading in this story, and the direction in general as well. Again, it's not something I really noticed on first watch or second watch, but now watching back and making notes of this review, I noticed that as well. If nothing else, the design of the village and the direction and the colour grading is great, even if the story kind of falls short in a couple of areas. The Doctor's remembering in the wrong direction line is fantastic. Again, it adds to this thing about tidal waves and ripples, and eventually the Doctor going too far and saving Ashilda, and finding out about his face, all that kind of stuff coming later on in the story. And this is kind of building up to it very early on. Another line that I really liked was, "Find the boss man and replace him," when Clara is asking the Doctor what they're going to do. Because obviously he pretends to be Odin with his yo-yo. A lovely nod back to the Fourth Doctor, by the way. And then the actual Odin, well, I say actual Odin, in inverted commas, the actual Odin appears in the sky, and he's not expecting that, so that's quite ironic, I think. Quite funny. And as well, I thought the way that Ashildr and Clara, when they're fiddling with the sonic sunglasses, and it's that makes the Maya warriors go up to them and teleport them to the ship, I found that actually a great choice and a great way to get them there. When you need characters to be in a certain place for a certain scene, and they have to get there from somewhere else, it's not always 100% convincing. But I really like this actually, and I found the way that the sonic sunglasses tied it all together very clever, really. I also noticed that with Clara and Ashildr on the spaceship, Clara kind of takes more of a Doctor role, as she has done in previous stories, and Ashildr is a bit like her companion, really. In hindsight, Ashildr's declaration of war, of what we've seen of her so far, she's quite quiet, and she's just cried, really, and gone, oh my god, what's this? Oh, what's going to happen? We're all going to die. So yeah, I found that a bit out of character on rewatch, because we need a reason for the Maya to come back, leading to Ashildr's death, leading to Clara's eventual demise. You know, you see what I mean? Everything ties together. And I just think that kind of bit felt a little bit forced. Maybe if they'd written it in a slightly different way, developed Ashildr more up to this point, because she has only been in the story for like 10 minutes by this point. And I get it's all about the Viking spirit, you know, all the people in the village, they would die for each other and they want to fight and have good over evil, but it just felt a little bit forced from Ashildr, given how she'd been presented so far. 12 hugging Clara is sort of sweet, I suppose, and it at least does develop themes from Series 8, because if you think about it, the whole hugging thing has been in the show since Deep Breath at the end, when the Doctor says, oh, I don't like hugging, all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of carried on throughout the Capaldi era. So, yeah, I don't really know how I feel about that, because while I can kind of see, oh, there's clearly no romantic undertones here, I know a lot of people kind of take this stuff and think, oh, it's Huafaldi or whatever they call it, the thing where people ship the Doctor and Clara, and in particular the 12th Doctor and Clara, and I cannot stand it. So it's an okay moment, as long as you don't kind of make it out to be something that it's clearly not. It's just two friends who are happy to see each other again, nothing else. The Doctor's how many people have actually held a sword in battle is dark in a way, actually, but again, it adds to the humour, and it's very entertaining, actually. And looking back, the whole idea of giving him a bunch of just normal Vikings to work with, because all the warriors have been taken away, I mean, A, it's a pretty clever idea, but B, it just allows for so much humour. It's a very funny concept, I think, because obviously it's going to go wrong, and he's going to despair and give up loads of times, but then eventually save the day, obviously. But it's just funny to see the journey that the Vikings and the Doctor take to get there at the end of the story, and the trouble they get into along the way. So I will admit that actually, up to this point on this rewatch, everything was going well, and then the Doctor kind of closed his eyes and started to translate the noise of a baby crying. Now this worked okay for Matt Smith's Doctor. A, it was funny because what Stormageddon was saying was funny, because he was too big for his boots, you know, and he was thinking, oh, my dad's useless and all that kind of stuff, and the Doctor was translating it while Craig was there. That worked, but actually taking it seriously, what the baby is saying, oh, I'm afraid, all that kind of stuff like that, it doesn't work, because it just looks ridiculous, particularly if Capaldi has his eyes closed. I mean, Capaldi, it's not his fault, he did the best with what he was given, but I think on the writer's part, so Matheson and Moffat, it was just to kind of step over the line, really, a little bit too kind of ridiculous, because this episode is very light-hearted, and while that's not a tone that I'm a particular fan of in a main series episode, because I don't mind it for Christmas specials, but in a main series episode, particularly in such a dark series like Series 9, it kind of jars a bit, and you can only kind of make it so ridiculous, so funny, before it crosses the line, and I think that's what happened here, unfortunately. So that is my first criticism, but we'll brush that under the carpet for now. I did like how the Doctor's line about how if an Earth village defeated the Maya, word would get out into the galaxy, and they'd get a reputation, and they'd come back, and that would create ripples and tidal waves, Again, yes, it sounds familiar. It's this ongoing theme throughout the whole of the story. But I didn't really notice it before, how apparent it was in the middle and start of the story. So I did enjoy that reference. You know, it's quite subtle, but it definitely works. Oh dear, again, more baby speak. Why? It's a really ridiculous moment when the bit where he's translating the baby for the second time and Clara says, "You've just decided to stay." And we're like, what? And she says, "The baby stopped crying." Seriously? Oh dear, yeah, I hate to kind of say this in a defending Series 9 review, but that's not one of the greatest moments ever. It's probably one of the worst, really. It just doesn't fit into this episode and into this series. The whole baby thing should just have been scrapped at the scripting process much earlier on. It doesn't work for Capaldi's Doctor. For me at least, this is the first moment in his tenure where he actually feels like he's just spouting lines out of his mouth that were written for Matt Smith's Doctor. It's just the baby thing. It really annoys me, that, because it's a bad thing in Series 9, and Series 9 is good. But anyway, again, we'll brush it under the carpet and leave it there this time, because there are some better moments in this story that I'm about to get onto, such as the mountains. Now you may be thinking, what? But I noticed the added detail in every single outdoor shot where mountains have been established in that very first shot after the titles. The mountains are still there. And you may be thinking, yeah, okay, that's what's to be expected. But I hadn't noticed that. Well, I had noticed that before, but it was just that attention to detail that I appreciated a lot more now. Again, because I've been there to the Coniston medieval village where it's filmed, and obviously there are no mountains there. It's just South Wales. There are trees and it's damp and wet. But they did a really good job at transforming this village and being consistent in every single shot, making sure the mountains were there, making sure the colours were consistent, and all the detail. It just really adds to the episode for me. And I think the whole kind of thing about how it's aesthetically pleasing, how it just looks really good, that kind of stops things like the baby moments from fully detracting from the episode, because there are good moments. If the design wasn't so great, then I'd probably think a lot less of the story. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not a really bad episode, but the design is definitely one of the best things about it, I think. I've mentioned this already, but Murray Gold's score, as usual, is brilliant. The whole kind of Viking-esque themes and cues, and Ashild's theme as well. I loved how that was worked into a Viking context, and how it was kind of really majestic and victorious, because obviously in later episodes we get various other variations of this theme, but I enjoyed seeing it here and noticing the score and noticing all these different themes in the background and how it progressed. That was really interesting, I think. One thing I did notice, well, I say notice, I mean I did notice it before on previous rewatches, but Clara is really pushy in this story. She's kind of telling the Doctor what to do, which is kind of annoying, really. I mean, I know I said last week that it's kind of acceptable for her to be slightly kind of reckless, because obviously that's where she's going as a character, and besides, she's always got good intentions at heart. But here it just kind of seems slightly borderline unnecessary, which is a shame, really. But she's basically the one that's telling the Doctor to stay. Yes, as the companion, as the human connection, obviously she kind of sees the need for him to stay and save the village more than he does, but just the way it was written, it brings me back to the baby thing as well, when she tries to make out that he's decided to stay because of the baby stopping crying, when in actual fact it's a bit of an excuse for her to say, okay, the baby stopped crying now, you're staying. You know what I mean? It's just kind of a bit forced, which is a shame, as I've said. Another character who seems forced, this will be no surprise to many of you, is Maisie Williams' Ashilda, who is obviously one of the greatest Doctor Who characters we've ever seen. While I do generally think that she's slightly underrated, because she did an alright job overall in Series 9, and I did enjoy seeing Ashilda's character develop, and I do appreciate what she added to the story arc and to the plot, but at the same time, Maisie Williams wasn't that great, and the episode was really kind of hyped. Oh, Maisie Williams is going to be in it, you know, BBC Doctor Who on Twitter going on and on about it ever since that first trailer came out. And it's a bit of a letdown, I think, because there was so much hype. It's just a bit disappointing when we actually just see that she's an ordinary Viking girl. Furthermore, her uniqueness and her kind of weirdness, all the stuff about how the girls think she's just like a boy and the boys think she's just another girl, it doesn't really go anywhere. You kind of feel there's maybe going to be some kind of homosexual, bisexual undertones there that are going to be developed or explored, but that doesn't happen. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that Ashilda is that way, but she's kind of portrayed to be that kind of character, really. And that whole thing about how she doesn't fit in, how she's weird, I mean, is it meant to make us feel more sympathetic for her when she dies at the end? Is that it? I don't know. Is it meant to highlight how human she was here, in contrast to how she is portrayed in the next story and further appearances in Series 9? I don't know, I've not really worked that one out yet. I might come back to it later in the series. But here at least, she just feels a little bit disappointing, first of all, and her character is undeveloped at this point, I think. I think that's all that can be said. And I guess it links back to her first bit where she declares war on the Maya. Her character just seems a little bit inconsistent, I think. That's the word I'm looking for. She just doesn't really go anywhere, really. Which again is a shame. There's a lot of promise in this story, but there are certain bits that just don't really go anywhere. So that kind of frustrates me. I will admit, the fire in the water climax thing, that's actually pretty clever. It's a unique, well-written way of kind of shoehorning the Doctor's plan into it and defeating the Maya. Because, let's face it, it's a Viking village. What else are they going to use? There's barely anything there, no warriors. Even if there were warriors, they probably wouldn't be able to defeat the Maya. So the final scene where they actually defeat the Maya and make fools of them is actually quite satisfying, I think, as plot climaxes go. I mean, it does kind of bring together all the story strands and resolves them, defeats the aliens, and does more really, because there's a thing with the Ashilda afterwards as well. Some people, I think, have said that the whole thing with the electric eels wouldn't be possible in that era, in the Viking times. But like the moon being an egg, which personally I don't actually mind, I quite like that, it's quite quirky, I think. I don't really care if it's not exactly 100% scientifically possible or accurate. I think in the context of this story, it works really well, actually. The metal coming from Clara's spacesuit, having that at the start of the story, and then seeing that component being used as part of the plan to defeat the Maya. Again, that's quite clever on the part of Mathieson and Moffat, and it's a clever way to work the required component of metal into the story. Because let's face it, you're not going to find stuff like that you find in a spacesuit in a Viking village. So it's a clever way of making that first scene relevant. Yeah, it's a bit convenient, I guess, but for a viewer to watch, I think that's actually quite clever, how it's just subtly put in there and then worked into the story later on. I've said already how I like how the climax plays out, and there are some very entertaining lines, like the Doctor's reverse the polarity of the neutron flow. I bet that means something, sounds great. He's basically just mocking his third incarnation. It's sort of reminiscent of multi-Doctor stories, where the Doctor is mocking his other selves for being Sandshoes or Chin or Grandad. So that was quite funny, and just a way really of poking fun at that line and questioning it, because it doesn't actually mean anything really, I think. It might have meant something in the original context when the Third Doctor first said it, I believe in the Sea Devils, but don't quote me on that. I think it was just scientific gobbledygook put into the story just because it sounds good, like the Doctor says. So it's also another way of poking fun at the writers and producers from the 70s in the context of the show, which is quite humorous. So the Maya helmet, using it to amplify Ashilda's dragon puppet, is actually quite a well thought through idea. I did appreciate that. I mean, it is part of this climax, but that in particular, the whole thing of making the Maya see something that's not there, because they have these eyepieces, they're robots. It's a fundamental flaw because you can manipulate what they see, and that in particular is probably one of the cleverest concepts in this story. It really does work very well, I think. But what doesn't work quite so well is how the helmet just drains Ashilda's life force, with practically no explanation. Again, it feels forced. It feels like the writers are saying, oh, Ashilda has to die so the Doctor can bring her back in like 5 minutes. So let's just say, you know, she dies because of the helmet. Yeah, I kind of guess it sort of works, but it just feels a bit underdeveloped. You know, I don't know, maybe if we'd had a line earlier on about how the Maya helmet can be deadly, can be destructive, can be harmful, it would have made more sense. Although, to be honest, it doesn't really make much sense, really. Draining her like a battery, it wasn't really hardwired into her, it was just placed over her head. So, yeah, that's not the most convincing plot point. But on the other hand, bringing Ashilda back works very, very well, I think. And the whole thing about I'm the Doctor and I save people is just such a thrilling moment. And when the Doctor realises where his face comes from, that flashback back to Series 4 with the Doctor and Donna is just brilliant. It's one of the best moments of the series, I think. Really, really well played out. And a very nice addition to the story. A flashback that works in the context of the story. You know, that's how they're done. They're used sparingly, but at the right moment when they're relevant, which is good. I liked how it was used here. And unlike most other elements in this story, it didn't feel forced. It felt right for the Doctor to say, okay, you know, oh, someone's died. I'm going to give up, I'm going to be unhappy and miserable. And then he looks in the water, and that's quite clever as well, because it's the fire in the water that saved the day in the first place. It's another interesting parallel. But he looks in the water, sees his reflection, and then he just realises, and it's such a great moment. Very, very well acted out by Peter Capaldi. One of his best moments as the Doctor, I think. It's just such a great scene. I really, really love that one. And I think Moffat did a great job of not having it in your face, these flashbacks, but also not saving this for finale, because it would have been disappointing, I think, as a finale element, as a story arc about the Doctor's face, and then you just realise that he picked it subconsciously to remind himself to save people. It works better here in this story, and it also gives this story a purpose in the context of the series, which is why I don't really hate it as much as I probably should do, because, well, I mean, I like the rest of Series 9 anyway, and I can kind of see how it fits into there. But yeah, there wasn't much hype. I think we knew it was coming initially on the original broadcast, but there wasn't a lot of hype about how it was going to work out, how it was going to be explained. It wasn't a story arc, like I say, and that worked better. To have these big, but at the same time small moments in kind of minor episodes like this, to just kind of beef them up a bit, really, and to make them more interesting. I also really love how the second Maya chip is introduced here. It obviously comes back in The Woman Who Lived and is used in the climax of that story. Again, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but you know, I appreciate that a lot more now, having watched Woman Who Lived and rewatched these episodes a couple more times. It just works really well because it ties these two stories together that are sort of a two-parter, but not. But really it's just the chip and the Ashildr that connect them, that are constant in both stories, apart from the Doctor as well and the TARDIS. So it's just really interesting to see the chip introduced here, knowing how it's used later on. I also really like the Doctor's line about barring accidents, when he's saying that Ashildr has basically lost the ability to die, which is another great line if you think about it, really. It works so well for 12 and his character. But the barring accidents bit is a nice reference to that Time Lord line about how they can live forever barring accidents. Not sure of the exact story, but it's a pretty famous quote. So again, I appreciated that on this rewatch. It's just these little things that you notice that are quite satisfying, really. The thing about finding someone you can't bear to live without is a very nice line. It's obviously foreshadowing what's going to happen to Clara and him, but it's subtle, again, like lots of other things in this story, like lots of other themes and story arc bits and bobs. It's not in your face, and yeah, it's just a little way of sort of foreshadowing Clara's death, really, and how the Doctor's going to cope with that. It's interesting how the hybrid is brought up again here. It definitely keeps you guessing about what it is, although looking back, obviously this is a red herring. Well, I say obviously, I mean, Ashildr sort of is the hybrid, but I'll get onto that in my Hellbent review at the end of the series. But essentially she's not the main hybrid of the series story arc. She's just another hybrid, another red herring really, thrown in to kind of keep you guessing. And in terms of the story arc, I think that definitely works, because fans will think, oh, we know who it is. You know, Ashildr is the hybrid, but obviously there's lots of stuff that comes after this that makes it even more confusing and complicated, which I will cover in later reviews. But it's just interesting how this is put in here to kind of throw you off the scent a bit more, and to make you think about what the hybrid could really be. So overall, there are some good moments in this story, some funny, entertaining moments and lines, but it's not my favourite story ever, as you can probably tell. And definitely in Series 9, it just sticks out like a sore thumb. Because apart from Ashildr, who is not very good in the story anyway, and the bit with the Doctor realising how he got his face, the series could have worked without it, really. You know, it doesn't add much to the series, to the story arc, the ongoing themes. Like, it kind of does a little bit, I suppose. My main problems, obviously, are the light-hearted tone. I mean, it sort of works, but bits of it, like the baby moments, are just jarring. And yeah, that definitely doesn't work for 12's Doctor and for this darker tone of the series. So what would I rate it out of 10? Well, I don't want to be too harsh, but at the same time, I'm not just going to give it loads and loads of praise, because, like I say, this series is about defending Series 9 as a whole, not necessarily individual episodes, and this is the only one really for me which is weak individually. It doesn't really stand up on its own 2 feet. So I'm thinking probably a 7 out of 10. Maybe that's a little bit generous. But yeah, I'll go with a 7 because there are some good funny lines, and the whole aesthetic look, the design of the Viking village really, and the score and Capaldi's performance are what really save it. Well, I say save. Yeah, I can't really make my mind up about this story. It's kind of sort of good, sort of bad. But yeah, it could have been a lot worse, I suppose, on a more positive note. So that's what I think of The Girl Who Died. But as always, it's now time to look at some of your comments, which I'm probably going to go through a little quicker this week, just because, well, I have not got too many this week, and also this review's been quite long, hence why I'm not going to read out the whole of my first comment, which is from Mondasian Monster, but you get the gist of what he's saying. There's just not a lot of substance to this story, and a lot of it is very disappointing and a bit of a letdown. So yeah, I completely agree, although it's slightly harsh maybe, but I don't know, I've got a pretty split opinion on this story. I don't really know what I think of it. My next one's from Jack Colgan, who says, a definite dripping quality, incredibly dull, and a pointless use of the whole why this face thing. Now actually, I think it was used well. As I've said already, I don't mind it not being in a series opener, or 2-parter, or series finale, because it gives this story a bit more substance, even though it doesn't really have much in the first place. But still, I don't think it should really have been anything more. I mean, maybe there could have been something bigger, like the Time Lords gave him that face for some other reason. I don't know, I've not really thought about it much. But I've kind of come to appreciate this, and I think it works pretty well to just have it this subtle, really. And the last one this week is from Isaac Dakin, who says, it was a nice pseudo-historical story, and was interesting to see an enemy defeated with a threat of humiliation. Resolving the mystery about the Doctor having Achilles' face was a nice twist, as it reminded him that he saves people. Yeah, I agree with that actually. The whole thing about humiliation, it's not something we've really seen before. And the scene where the Doctor defeats the Maya is just so satisfying, because all the Vikings are so happy and grateful, but then of course this contrast with the Shilda's death that comes straight after this, a really big difference there in mood, and of course that fuels the Doctor, and then that leads on to the Doctor's realisation about his face, which, as I've said already, is just such a fantastic moment. Really is the best of the story and one of the best of the series. But anyway, that's The Girl Who Died, over and done with. Not my favourite story of the series, not my favourite story ever, but there we go. It's gone. But thankfully the other stories in this series, the following 7, I really enjoy each and every one of them. So that is good. Even Sleep No More and even Hellbent. But again, I'll get onto that later into the series. So thank you very much for watching this review and putting up with me. Please let me know what you think of this story, if you think I'm wrong, if you think I'm right. Yeah, it's an interesting one because, like I say, I'm meant to be defending Series 9, and I am defending Series 9, but yeah, it's just this story isn't the strongest individually. That's the problem really for me. So yes, please comment what you think below, and comment your thoughts on The Woman Who Lived, or tweet them to me at Stetson Doctor, so I can include them in next week's review, and I'll see you then for that. So thank you very much for watching, and bye for now.